Welcome to my Stirling single. This is part 20, preparing the smokebox for painting. It's going to be nice to have a bit of spare time to work on this engine again. Apologies for the headboard. That was put there by a friend of mine called Alexander Carnes from the USA. And that's enough frivolity for this episode. The time has come when I need to prepare this engine for painting. On this type of engine, there's a kind of fairing that goes around the smokebox and around the cylinders, and this is held in place by some brass screws. Somehow I need to lose these, because it just wouldn't look good if you could see the brass screws under the paint. I intend to paint the smokebox using some high temperature paint. The last thing that I need are lots of coats of filler primer, which would just blister when I ran the engine in steam. The last job I did on this engine, and that was quite a while ago, was to apply some JB weld wherever I could see a visible bolt. And here, using a flapper wheel in my Proxxon motor tool, I'm grinding the JB weld away so it's flush with the fairing. As an experiment, I just put a blob of JB weld over each bolt, and this is obviously not going to be a good thing to do. After grinding away the JB weld with the flapper wheel and using some wet to dry sandpaper, I can still feel undulations in the fairing. Apart from filling these slot-headed countersunk screws or bolts, I also need to scratch every part of the brass with some sandpaper. Brass is a very soft metal, so I don't want to rub too hard, because that would just make things worse. I'm being very gentle with the flapper wheel. A flapper wheel is far less violent than a drum sander. This sequence is going to be very repetitive, grinding off the JB weld with the flapper wheel, followed by rubbing it down with some wet to dry sandpaper. This job is quite tedious, it's very labour intensive, and it's a bit nerve-wracking because if I do it wrong I would make a mess of the brass fairing. And I really don't want to do that. This engine, as far as it goes, is far from perfect, but it's a very nice engine. After the preparation of the brass smokebox, one job that I'm not looking forward to particularly is repainting the frames, because the builder, for some reason unknown to me entirely, painted the frames the wrong colour. The frames on a Great Northern locomotive were in Great Northern Railway's chocolate brown, not Great Northern Railway's sort of a red crimson lake effect. Maybe the builder just had some paint left over from painting an LMS locomotive Crimson Lake. As this is wet or dry sandpaper, I decided to use it wet, and I got a much better cut. If you use any kind of emery cloth or sandpaper, wet or dry or otherwise, and use it dry, it clogs very quickly. It's worth mentioning that before I filled these cross-headed brass countersunk bolts, I tightened them up using a screwdriver. Even before I fill around the bolt heads using JB weld, I'm going over the area with the flapper wheel, because some of these bolts were slightly above the level of the brass. I have a few of these, a friend of mine sent me them. These have a flexible rubber end with pieces of diamond embedded in the rubber. Not really suitable for this job because they polish the area. I don't want the area to be polished, I want it to be scratched to provide a key for the paint. So it's back to the 400 grit wet to dry sandpaper. In this clip I'm wiping the debris away just so I can see what it's looking like. And it's not bad. It's quite difficult though working around the handrail stanchion, which is definitely in the way at both sides. When I have a look inside the smokebox, I cannot see how these are fastened. This is not a new model, it's been in steam many times and done quite a lot of running. Inside the smokebox it's very sooty and oily, and even with a light I can't really see what the fixing is on the end of this stanchion. It just looks like a rusty blob of something or other. At this stage I'm going to have to be careful and be very patient. I'm using a piece of mahogany planking and a large screwdriver. The mahogany planking is to stop the screwdriver from marking the front of the smokebox. And by being firm but careful, in no time at all, the handrail pops out of the stanchions at both sides. That was easier than I thought it was going to be. Ordinarily when I look at a job like this I would think, well, probably the best thing to do is to just chisel off the stanchion, because they're normally made from brass. But these two handrail stanchions either side of the smokebox are very different, as they are much shorter than the rest. These handrail stanchions look to have been handmade, and here you can see how they were fitted to the smokebox, with a very small cheesehead slot-headed bolt from the inside. These were quite easy to remove once the handrail wasn't through them, and I retrieved the bolts from the bottom of the smokebox using a telescopic magnet. I'm going to start work on the other side of the engine, and the first thing to do is to tighten up thoroughly every one of the bolts. These bolts are made of plated brass, so the expansion is going to be about the same as the rest of the brass part of the smokebox and the fairing. I can safely say that now I've removed the centre handrail stanchion from the smokebox, cleaning it up and rubbing it down is a far easier job. I can easily work around leaving the existing handrail in place because that's going to be very difficult to remove. I have a sneaky feeling that the front handrail was put on complete with the stanchions before the boiler was in place. Now it's back to the flapper wheel in my Proxon motor tool and make sure that none of these bolts protrude from the brass fairing. By doing it this way, I think it's sensible. Not only am I making sure that none of the bolts stick out, by scratching this area with the flapper wheel, it's a good key for the filler that I'm going to use to fill them in. For filling jobs like this, my filler of choice is JB Weld. As the areas to be filled are quite minimal, I could use cellulose stopper, but I don't think this would handle the heat. The Smokebox of a coal-fired miniature steam locomotive gets extremely hot indeed. Once the Smokebox and the boiler barrel have been painted, I will be firing this engine on the bench a few times using gas. The Smokebox in particular will get much hotter though when it's been coal-fired. Now it's time to rub down this side of the fairing using some 400 grit wet-to-dry sandpaper. I thought it would be a good idea to try a small rotary wire brush in the Proxon. And this certainly cleaned up a lot of the tarnish. Particularly as this engine had been steamed, it was quite badly tarnished, and painting over tarnished brass really is the last thing I want to do. By the time I've finished this Smokebox and filled it and rubbed it down and repeated the process, it should be well keyed for the paint. I think it's time to take the Smokebox door off. This is a simple job, you just pull out the pin. Also I thought, in reality it was quite difficult to remove the pin. But in the end, with the help of a small screwdriver, I got it out. You can see all the soot and residue on the inside of the Smokebox door, as well as in the Smokebox. By removing the Smokebox, it does mean I will be able to mask that off and paint it separately. I found this wire brush really useful for this job, but I really must add a health and safety warning. This is very important. If you're using one of these small high-speed wire brushes, which shed bristles like there's no tomorrow, and the bristles fly everywhere, it is extremely important to wear some eye protection. I spent quite a while yesterday removing small pieces of stainless steel from the wire brushes from my jacket. These bristles are painful when they stick in your skin, and it would be a far worse thing if one or more of them stuck in your eyeball. And on that painful note, I'd just like to say, stay safe, stay well, thanks for watching, and I hope you found it useful. Please take the time to visit my Mainsteam Models website. Click on the section of the website that says Video Playlists. And by doing that, you will find it very easy to find other videos that you may like to watch.